Thank you very much, Peter. The present talk concerns just one among the diverse topics that Peter Garside and I have been presented with in our research for the forthcoming volume of Scott's shorter poems, and is in its way a sequel to the talk for the club about Scott's German-influenced poems that my co-editor gave last year. The forthcoming volume will include some 14 or 15 poems with a direct link to the theatre of the early 19th century. Besides acknowledging my co-editor, I would also wish to thank the National Galleries of Scotland for permission to illustrate my talk with images of paintings and engravings in their care, and Lee Simpson, your wonderful events convener, for helping me with the technical business of showing them. Scott seems to have been an enthusiastic theatre goer ever since, as a child of 6 years old, he was taken to a performance of Shakespeare's As You Like It at Bath. He referred many years later to the theatre as the enchanted palace of his childhood, giving a vivid account in an article for the Quarterly Review of 1826 of the impression made on him by the performance. Scott recalls the astonishment with which we looked upon the apathy of the older part of our company, who, having the means, did not spend every evening in the theatre. The theatre was also the favourite resort of the youth, Scott, the price of admission being no trifling incentive to labour at the copying of legal documents Scott undertook as an apprentice writer to the Signet in his father's office, and for which he was paid by the sheet. In Charlotte Charpentier he chose a bride who was also a keen theatre attender, and Lockhart comments that for many years I doubt if they ever spent a week in Edinburgh without indulging themselves in this amusement. In Scott's early manhood, the Edinburgh Theatre was very much a satellite of the London theatrical scene, where the patent theatres represented an unbroken tradition of performance going back to the Restoration of 1660. While as a young man, Scott was simultaneously stimulating his early interest in Scottish folklore and ballads and familiarising himself with German Romantic literature, he also translated several German plays into English. Apart from his translation of Goethe's Götz von Berlichingen, published in 1799, several of his manuscript translations of German plays dating from the late 1790s have survived, including those of Meyer's Fürst von Stromberg, Steinberg's Otto von Wittelsbach, and Iffland's Die Mündel. Michael Wood, who's sitting over there, knows much more about these early translations from German plays than I pretend to do, but probably they were exercises undertaken as part of Scott's learning the German language, rather than preliminary drafts of scripts intended ultimately for the London theatre. The House of Aspen is rather different. It's a loose version rather than a close translation of a play by Leonhard Wächter, writing under his pseudonym of Veit Weber, entitled Die Heilige Fame oder der Sturz der Aspenau, the Holy Tribunal or the Downfall of Aspenau. This does look like Scott's attempt to start a career as a playwright. His version included several songs to suit the taste of the theatre audiences of his day, and it was certainly offered for production at Drury Lane, since Scott's letter to Richard Heber of the 19th of October 1800 records its rejection by Kemble, who managed that theatre. The play was then set aside for almost 30 years, until Scott offered it to Charles Heath in fulfilment of a somewhat troublesome promise to contribute to Heath's annual The Keepsake for 1830. Although the House of Aspen was staged at the Old Surrey Theatre in London, as well as at Edinburgh's Theatre Royal soon after its eventual publication, this was a tribute to Scott as veteran poet and novelist of European reputation, rather than for its theatrical qualities, and he appears to have had no direct involvement in either production, other than giving the manager of the Edinburgh Theatre a reluctant consent to its staging. The rejection of Scott's play by Drury Lane in 1800 seems to have marked the beginning and end of any serious attempt by Scott to become playwright for the London stage. 3 songs from the House of Aspen, however, are to be included in our volume of Scott's shorter poems. As a good and helpful friend, Scott did have some limited involvement with the London theatrical scene after his failure to get the House of Aspen staged at Drury Lane, helping Daniel Terry, for instance, with the dramatisation of Guy Mannering for London, sending him The Lullaby of an Infant Chief to be included in the production. But on the whole, Scott's involvement with the theatre meant the Edinburgh Theatre Royal. The engraving you can see reproduced on the screen is a drawing by Thomas Shepherd, and it shows the building as it was in the 1820s. The theatre was conveniently situated in Shakespeare Square, at the junction of the old and new towns, quite close to the North Bridge, sort of that bit opposite Register House, and roughly occupying the site of the general post office building later on. I don't know what it is now, but it's still there, the post office building. As opened in 1769, it had originally been a very plain building, but around 1788 the colonnade you can see at the front was added, and also the 3 statues on the roof line. These depict Shakespeare at the apex, with the comic and the tragic muse on either side. The repertoire of the theatre tended to be somewhat restricted, partly perhaps because of the after effects of the earlier 18th century opposition to the theatre by the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, but at any rate by the status of the Edinburgh Theatre as a satellite of the more robust London theatrical scene. Moreover, the very idea of a national theatre for Scotland was politically compromised in 2 very different ways in Scott's youth and early manhood. As Barbara Bell and others have argued, from a London perspective, especially a government perspective, a national theatre for Scotland was one that had been at least potentially tainted with Jacobitism. so that a politically safe Scottish repertoire largely meant performances of such plays as Shakespeare's Macbeth, Hume's Douglas and Schiller's Maria Stuart. A further complication specific to the 1790s was that in France, revolutionary activity often featured at theatres. In April 1794, the young Scot and his friends set themselves in opposition to a group of Irish medical students who mustered in the pit of Edinburgh's Theatre Royal and lost no opportunity of calling for revolutionary tunes, applauding every speech that could bear a seditious meaning, and drowning the national anthem in howls and hootings. On a chosen evening, Scott and his party assembled in the front of the pit, armed with stout cudgels, and determined to have God Save the King not only played without interruption, but sung in full chorus, i.e. all together and probably in unison, by both company and audience. The theatre, Scott argued years afterwards, was, like the printing press, potentially as powerful an instrument for evil as for good. As he saw it, a full audience attending a first-rate piece may be compared to a national convention in which every order of the community, from the peers to the porters, send their representatives. Royal attendance enhanced this representative effect, and when George IV, during his Scottish visit of August 1822, attended Edinburgh's Theatre Royal, Scott composed a new verse to the national anthem that effectively exorcised the Jacobin as well as the Jacobite threat of the past when sung aloud that evening. Not going to sing, I'm going to read it. Bright beams are soon o'ercast, soon our brief hour is past, losing our king. Honoured, beloved and dear, still shall his parting ear our latest accents hear, God save the king. In Scott's lifetime, the auditorium of a British theatre, as well as the stage, was fully lit during the performance, rendering the audience itself more prominent and encouraging such interactions between the stage and different sections of the auditorium. Scott himself, at the height of his European fame as avowed poet and more than suspected historical novelist, undoubtedly formed part of the public spectacle. When Gatty Bell, the country heroine of James Hogg's novel The Three Perils of Woman of 1823, visits Edinburgh Theatre Royal, her attention is taken as much by the audience around her as by the actors on the stage. She writes home to her family, Sir Walter Scott and one of his daughters were in a box right opposite. She was dressed with simplicity and good taste, but I looked most of all at him and thought him exceedingly good-looking, although my companions would not let me say it. He did not look often at the players, but when he did, he made his lips thin and looked out at the tail of his eye as if he deemed it all a joke. Lockhart relates that it was usual when Scott entered his box for him to receive some mark of general respect and admiration from the audience, applause which he would acknowledge, for example, with a bow. Attendance at and involvement with the Edinburgh Theatre were very much related to Scott's social life. He had been introduced to the young Irish actress Sarah Smith, for example, by the Buccleuch ladies, as he told Anna Seward in a letter of the 11th of August 1807, adding that she was a person for whom he had an especial regard as a very good and pleasing girl with high talents for her profession. This star performer of London's Covent Garden Theatre was engaged to play for the first time at Edinburgh's Theatre Royal in the summer of 1807. She made her first appearance on the 25th of July as Portia in The Merchant of Venice, following this up with a number of tragic roles and playing Madame Clermont in a new play entitled Adrian and Arilla, or A Mother's Vengeance, for her benefit night on the 8th of August. Scott composed a poetic address for her to be delivered on the occasion, sending it from Ashes Steel with a compliment on her performance skills on the 4th of August, only a few days before the occasion for which it was intended. He wrote, I send you the promised lines, which, indifferent as they are, have proved better than I durst venture to hope, considering that I have been obliged to postpone the task of writing them till this morning. The idea is better than the execution, but I comfort myself that many better lines have wanted the advantages which your recitation will give mine. In his letter, Scott invited Miss Smith to visit him at Ashy Steel on her way southwards
after the conclusion of her Edinburgh engagement, an invitation which was thankfully accepted. The friendship was continued over the following years, with Scott giving Miss Smith a copy of Marmion, and the actress in turn seeking his advice about dramatising his narrative poems for the Dublin Theatre. In his poem for her, Scott compares her trip northwards from London to a religious pilgrimage, making her express her own diffidence of the new audience in terms of the pilgrim's sense of unworthiness as he approaches the shrine of the saint. She, as the flutterings here avow, feels all the pilgrim's terrors now, yet sure on Caledonian plain the stranger never sued in vain. 'Tis yours the hospitable task to give the applause she dare not ask, and they who bid the pilgrim speed, the pilgrim's blessing be their meed. Scott's most important social connections among actors, however, were with various members of the celebrated Kemble clan. He first met the stellar tragic actor John Philip Kemble during the Easter holidays of 1807 at Bentley Priory in Stanmore in Middlesex, the country house of the Marquess of Abercorn. A welcome interlude from his business in London of petitioning the government on behalf of the clerks of session. Kemble became a friend and visited at Ashy Steel, as well as Scott's Edinburgh home in Castle Street, and Scott was also on familiar terms with other members of Kemble's famous theatrical family, including his even better known sister, actress and cultural icon Sarah Siddons. By 1809, the patent of Edinburgh's Theatre Royal had expired and was up for renewal, at which point Scott intervened decisively to facilitate a takeover by Henry Siddons, Kemble's nephew and son of Sarah Siddons. He was to hold the patent for 21 years, paying an annual instalment of 2,000 guineas of the purchase money, so that the theatre would become his property when the patent expired in 1830. With the assistance of Henry Siddons' talented actress wife Harriet and her brother William Henry Murray, Scott hoped that the theatre would henceforward provide drama superior to what he termed the garbage of melodrama and pantomime. And of course, engaging Henry Siddons would ensure the appearance and support of the older generation of the Kemble dynasty. At this time, Scott joined the proprietors of the theatre by purchasing a share, and also became one of its trustees. Immediately he set about fostering a native dramatic tradition, bringing the manuscript of Joanna Baillie's The Family Legend back with him from London in June 1809, and quickly securing the enthusiastic support of the new theatre manager for putting it into production. Scott regarded Joanna Baillie as the best dramatic writer whom Britain has produced since the days of Shakespeare and Massinger, and she was also Scottish by birth. He was extremely active in promoting the success of the family legend in Edinburgh in every possible way, even superintending rehearsals at the theatre. Incidental music was to consist predominantly of Scottish airs in keeping with its historical subject matter of a 16th century feud between two Highland clan chieftains. And the play was to be supported by a prologue written by Scott himself and an epilogue written by veteran Scottish author Henry Mackenzie. Scott's prologue emphasised the attraction of Scottish legends to a Scottish audience at home and abroad, Baillie's fame as the author of plays on the Passions, the Highland origins of the plot, and lastly he asked Caledon to approve the filial token of a daughter's love. The Edinburgh Annual Register, in its article on Scottish drama, thought Scott's prologue, written with a romantic nationality of allusion to the subject of the tragedy, a loveliness of imagery, and a glow of feeling strongly characteristic of the bard of chivalry. Baillie's play was successful, but could not on its own secure the national drama Scott wished to establish. 2 years later, trouble was taken to present the new Icelandic play of Scottish traveller and antiquarian Sir George Stuart Mackenzie as a worthy successor. The Edinburgh Evening Courant of the 18th of January 1812, for instance, anticipated that if Helga or the rival minstrels be as successful as the family legend, there can be no doubt but we shall find many gentlemen of literary abilities willing to come forward to assist the drama of the country. Icelandic scenery was specially commissioned, and as with Baillie's play, Scott and Henry Mackenzie wrote a prologue and epilogue for it. Scott's prologue satirises the spectacular and contrived stage effects of pantomime and melodrama. Then rushed the stage auxiliaries along, man, monster, and machine, and motley throng. For now no more our mean processions pass, in Hamlet's phrase, each actor on his ass. Car, camel, warhorse, water dog appear, and Bluebeard's elephant o'erwhelms the rear. He then contrasts these with the historic lay of Icelandic saga and legend, and urges the audience to list then and learn how northern minstrels strove, stung by the rivalry of fame and love. Unfortunately, Mackenzie's play was markedly unsuccessful, the first night audience rendering the whole tragedy ludicrous. Scott himself reported to Joanna Bailey that even those who went as the author's friends caught the infection and laughed most heartily all the while they were applauding. Initially, according to the Caledonian Mercury of the 25th of January, Sir George hoped to revise it for a second performance, but ultimately he decided to withdraw his play. The tragedian John Philip Kemble was widely known as a studious, scholarly actor, and was clearly sympathetic to Scott's wish to raise the tone of the Edinburgh theatre. When due to retire from the stage in 1817, it was natural both that Kemble should take a formal farewell of his appreciative Edinburgh audience and that he should invite Scott's participation. Writing to his old friend Mrs. Clephane on the 23rd of March 1817, Scott expressed his particular appreciation of Kemble's acting the Roman patrician roles such as Coriolanus, Brutus and Cato, as well as expressing some annoyance, given his own current ill health from gallstones, about the process of producing a poetic farewell for the celebrated actor. He made me write some lines to speak when he withdraws, and he has been here, criticising and correcting till he got them quite to his mind, which has, I think, rather tired me, for he would not make the alterations on the broad ground that as he was to speak them he had a title to please himself, but dragged me into the land of metaphysics and rhythmical harmony, where I am not at present very equal to follow him. Kemble's final performance as the eponymous hero of Macbeth, Shakespeare's Scottish play, took place less than a week later, on the 29th of March 1817, when he recited a shortened version of Scott's lines in costume at the end of his performance. These were delivered, according to Ballantyne's weekly paper, The Sale Room, with exquisite beauty, and with an effect that was evidenced by the tears and sobs of many of the audience. His own emotions were very conspicuous. When his farewell was closed, he lingered long on the stage as if unable to retire. The house again stood up and cheered him with the waving of hats and long shouts of applause. Interestingly, however, Scott declined to write a second poem for the London commemorations of Kemble's retirement from the stage. Responding on the 5th of May 1817 to an appeal from London actor George Bartley, husband of the former Miss Smith, Scott stated that, "From the literary talents belonging to the names you enumerate, you must certainly be considered as having Moses and the prophets on your side of the border, and cannot need assistance from our northern regions." Scott's Edinburgh tribute sees Campbell on stage for the last time at the end of his long stage career as the worn warhorse of Job 39:25, who rouses himself at the sound of the trumpets and smelleth the battle afar off. However, the actor knows that his powers must soon fade, and that some time is necessary for reflection between the theatre and the grave. Campbell is then finally compared by Scott to the Roman in the Capitol, and the address concludes with the Latin Ave atque vale. And all that you can hear, or I can tell, is, friends and patrons, hail and fare you well. By this time it had become obvious that the Siddons lease of the patent for the Edinburgh Theatre Royal was not going well, and the Ave atque vale salutation might well apply to the Siddons management as well as to Henry Siddons' famous uncle. When Siddons had died in 1815, his speculation in becoming manager of the Edinburgh Theatre Royal had been publicly revealed as an unsuccessful one. Murray, in addressing the Edinburgh audience to request permission for a rise in admission prices, revealed that Siddons had sunk his own private property in the theatre, and that even so the new season would begin with a debt of £3,100, his late brother-in-law having struggled to meet the most recent instalment of the purchase money. Scott seems to have been deeply affected and permanently by the precarious financial position in which Siddons' widow Harriet was left. Let's see if I can get a picture of her up. There she is. This is by painting by John Woods, and it's in the National Portrait Gallery. PG 214, if you want to go and look at it. The date of this portrait is not given, but it's perhaps a fair representation of Harriet Siddons at the time of her husband's death, when she was in her early 30s. With her dark hair elaborately styled and contrasting nicely with her white shoulders and her little pearl and garnet earrings, she presents a confidently glamorous and fashionable image. But nevertheless, she carried heavy responsibilities, not only for the Theatre Royal patent, but also for the upbringing of several young and dependent children. Scott obviously admired her, describing her as a great friend of mine and a most excellent person, as well as a charming actress. He was always accordingly amenable to an appeal from this lady for a theatrical address for a special occasion, as for instance when she had a summer engagement in 1821 at Henry Harris's brand new Dublin Theatre Royal. Scott wrote to his son Walter, who was there with the army, on the 27th of June. "I'm happy to see Mrs. Siddons has been so well received in Dublin, and am very sorry that you are not there to show her some attention and civility." Mrs. Siddons had clearly requested Scott to write a closing address for her final performance on the 7th of July, and Scott obliged, although his letter enclosing the lines did not reach her in time to be used, and probably arrived in Dublin almost as she left the city. Another poetic address, specially written for her to speak after performing in the character of Mary, Queen of Scots, also remained unused, as the production of the relevant play was apparently cancelled. Scott stresses the attraction of such a heroine to a Scottish audience. There is a talisman in that word Mary. "O Mary's memory, the learned quarrel, by Mary's grave the poet plants his laurel. Time's echo, old tradition, makes her name the constant burthen of his faltering theme. In each old hall his grey-haired heralds tell of Mary's picture and of Mary's cell, and show, my fingers tingle at the thought, the loads of tapestry that poor queen wrought." It was first published as Scott's contribution to a literary annual, the Literary Souvenir for 1825, and of course will be included along with the Dublin address in our forthcoming volume of Scott's shorter poems. The farewell address Scott wrote for Harriet Siddons to speak when she retired from the Theatre Royal in March 1830 showed he well remembered the early distressing days of her widowhood. Though 15 years after the death of her husband, she was a secure and prosperous woman, and indeed, having paid up the annual instalments of the purchase price, now the outright owner of the Theatre Royal. She was made to refer to the kindness of the Edinburgh audience. "In misery's hours of deprivation shone, when sympathy hope's dying lamp renewed, and anguish softened into gratitude. Ah, generous soothers of the widow's cares, despise not now her blessings and her prayers. 'Tis all she has, but warrant high is given, such prayer and blessings find the path to heaven." Harriet Siddons had been able to continue with the Edinburgh Theatre Royal partly by relying on her financially capable brother, actor William Henry Murray. Let's see if I can get him. There he is. This is a William Allen portrait of 1848. Again, it's in the National Galleries of Scotland, PG 190. This dates from 1848, and it's clearly much later than the portrait of his sister, and shows a middle-aged man. Murray was in fact around 7 years younger than his sister, and the two were so strikingly alike physically as to give real point to their playing of Viola and Sebastian, the twin sister and brother whose identities are frequently confused by the other characters in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. Scott alludes to the exquisite effect of their likeness in these roles in noting the striking resemblance between Fergus and Flora MacIver in Volume 1 of Waverley. Scott included in his retirement address for Harriet Siddons an earnest appeal to the public for continued support for her brother's management of the theatre, even though he had noted 5 years earlier that Murray is making a fortune for his sister and family on the very bargain which Siddons, poor fellow, could not have sustained for 2 years longer. Murray's rather startling success was founded on the establishment of a national drama, though perhaps not quite the one Scott had envisaged originally when manoeuvring for the patent to be taken by Henry Siddons. The Waverley novels were a runaway publishing success and contained memorable characters and pithy, racy dialogue that could easily be extracted and reworked into a theatrical script. They were also unquestionably decorous reading for the drawing room and parlour, so that dramatisations would attract a more extensive family audience of wider middle-class background, one traditionally inclined to doubt the respectability of theatre-going. On the 15th of February 1819, a dramatised version of Rob Roy opened at an almost bankrupt Theatre Royal, which filled the house for 41 consecutive nights and was repeated many times each season during Murray's management and long afterwards. According to the theatrical historian James C. Dibdin, it was known as the managerial sheet anchor, and when in doubt, Scottish theatre managers for many years seem invariably to have staged Rob Roy. The outstanding performance of the original cast was that of a comic actor recently transferred from Glasgow to the Edinburgh Company, Charles Mackay, playing Bailey Nicol Jarvie. That's him. This engraving of Mackay as Jarvie by John Horsburgh was made after a painting of William Allen. It's clearly a popular genre painting of the people collected famous engravings of actors in their best known roles. You might know Hogarth's portrait of Garrick, for example, as Richard III. Scott reported enthusiastically both on the financial implications of the success of the play for the Theatre Royal and on Mackay's performance in a letter to his friend Terry of the 18th of April 1819. Murray, he noted, has absolutely netted upwards of £3,000. To be sure, the man who played the Bailey made a piece of acting equal to whatever has been seen in the profession. For my own part, I was actually electrified by the truth, spirit and humour which he threw into the part. It was the living Nicol Jarvie, conceited, pragmatical, cautious, generous, proud of his connection with Rob Roy, frightened for him at the same time, and yet extremely desirous to interfere with him as an adviser. The original painting by Sir William Allen, from which this engraving is made, is now at Abbotsford, a tribute to Scott's admiration of Mackay's acting in this play. Several other Waverley plays rapidly followed at the Theatre Royal, including The Antiquary or The Heir of Glenallan, and The Heart of Midlothian in 1820, and The Legend of Montrose or the Children of the Mist and The Bride of Lammermoor in 1822. Here was an indisputably loyalist Scottish national drama, supportive of the Union and of the Hanoverian monarchy. And when George IV, on an official royal visit to Edinburgh in 1822, attended the theatre, the bill announced that the play to be performed at this command performance of the 27th of August would be The National Opera of Rob Roy MacGregor or Auld Lang Syne. The company had a problem 2 years later, however, when St Ronan's Well was to be staged at the Theatre Royal for the benefit night of William Murray the manager on the 5th of June 1824. As Barbara Bell and John Ramage have indicated in their article Meg Dodds Before the Curtain, the dramatisation of Scott's novel by James Robinson Planchet, the stock author of London's Covent Garden Theatre at this time, contained no role for Charles Mackay, since the chief comic role was that of a female one, that of Meg Dodds, the elderly landlady of the St Ronan's Inn. In the event, Mackay played Meg Dodds in drag, though not as the pantomime dame we might envisage, since Scott praised him to Terry for the way in which he kept his gestures and his action more within the range of female decorum than I thought possible. It was traditional at the close of the theatre manager's benefit evening for him to come forward at the end of the play and thank the audience for their support during the current season. To support Murray's company, Scott wrote an epilogue for the first performance of St Ronan's Well for Murray's benefit performance, to be spoken at the end of the evening as the traditional manager's address would have been, but by Mackay as Meg Dodds rather than by Murray himself. It seems likely, however, that Murray was on stage among the boys who surrounded Meg, following her and teasing her, since she opens her lively address by telling the stagekeeper to lend yon muckleane a whack. That, I think, it must have caused a laugh, having the stagekeeper thumping the manager. Meg's address is substantially a catalogue of physical and social changes in Edinburgh during Scott's lifetime, among which the Theatre Royal itself stands out as the single constant feature both of past and present Edinburgh. Meg strongly disapproves of novelties such as the modern Edinburgh hotels. At the previous Old Town taverns, gentles used to drink good wine and eat cheap dinners, whereas at the new-fangled pretentious hotels, they are sae greedy and sae gleg that if ye serve but wi' an egg, and that's poor picking, in comes a chield and makes a leg and charges chicken. She follows this up with an appeal to support Murray's management of the Theatre Royal, that also contrasts the new-fangled unfavourably with the traditional. And since I see you're in a hurry, your patience I'll nae longer worry, but be sae cruise, as speak a word for ane Will Murray that keeps this house. Meg notes that plays are old-fashioned things in truth, especially by comparison with the wonders mere uncouth of ventriloquism. This is a topical allusion to the performances given during April and May that year by French ventriloquist Nicolas Marie Alexandre Vatemar to capacity crowds at the Caledonian Theatre at the head of Leith Walk. Scott himself, it should be noted, enjoyed Vatemar's performance when he gave a private display of his talents at Abbotsford that summer, and indeed wrote him a poetical tribute. Meg urges that Murray has a special claim not available to visiting novelty performers as the man who has stood and sentry o'er this big house that's far frae rent-free for a lone sister. Murray's advertisement for his benefit night had mentioned that Scott's epilogue was written expressly for this occasion, and Mackay's delivery of it was clearly a continuing draw for an Edinburgh audience. When St Ronan's Well was staged again during the succeeding autumn, the advertisement noted, "At the end of the play, Mr Mackay will deliver the address in the character of Meg Dodds, which was last season attended with so much applause." Only towards the end of his life did Scott's interest in the Edinburgh stage appear to flag. His wife, with whom he had shared this taste, died in 1826, and his friend Harriet Siddons had moved to London on her retirement in the spring of 1830. Scott's own lameness was also increasing, and early in 1830 he had the first of a series of strokes. A regretful entry in his journal for the 16th of June 1830, noting that he is about to see the young Fanny Campbell act for the first time, adds, "It is 2 or 3 years since I have been in a theatre, once my delight," though, as W.E.K. Anderson points out, he had clearly forgotten at least one theatre visit during the previous year. Of Fanny Campbell herself he had written in the autumn of 1829 that he was not surprised that she has shone forth from a constellation which has long been so brilliant. To him she was clearly a youthful reminder of theatrical friendships with other members of the Kemble clan in his past, in something of the same way that the young 5th Duke of Buccleuch obviously recalled to Scott's mind the Duke's parents, who had been among the closest friends of his prime. Although he was never a significant playwright for the theatre, Scott's writings for the Edinburgh stage serve as a reminder that altogether there was probably no man outside the theatrical profession who had a greater impact on the Scottish theatre than he had exerted, by one means and another, during his best years as a celebrity poet and novelist. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Julie. You will take some questions, won't you?
Yes.
You'll stay here.
Disappearing.
It's amazing to hear
about another facet of Scott's life. How did he manage to fit in all these things and have such a incredible influence in so many different directions? But thanks, it was a very full and clear account of what he did, and it's good to hear it. So, have anybody got any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gillian. That was absolutely fascinating, and so fantastic to have the theatre placed, well, given so much in the foreground of Scott's interests. I've got loads and loads of questions for you, but I'll spare you. But maybe just two wee ones. First of all, we definitely know that when he's writing the essay on the drop, well, throughout his interest in Dryden and onwards, Scott's so interested in the institution of the theatre and also the physical makeup of the theatre space. Do we have any records, or even can we get enough of a picture from fictional sources at the time of the size of the Theatre Royal and how many people it could admit?
I'm not sure about the exact numbers, but I know that there's praise from both Scott and Lockhart for the small scale of the Edinburgh Theatre and its intimacy. When the, I think it was Covent Garden burnt down, they built this huge theatre, and Scott comments that it was far too big, that the expressions on the actors' faces, the sort of gestures were a bit lost on the audience, and that they were often playing to a sort of half-empty auditorium rather than the one that was full, that prostitutes and other undesirables were encouraged by the sort of huge spaces of the theatre. So I think the intimacy of the rather old by then theatre building in Edinburgh was very attractive to Scott.
Eric.
This morning I was taken just to do a little bit of homework before this, looking at the amazingly long index, which there is 75 pages in Walter Scott's journal, so it covers everything about Edinburgh life at the time. And I looked up a wee bit about the theatres, and it said it was actually quite small. I thought, well, about 300, it was quite a small.
Thank you for that.
Theatre, but there are references back in. And for the interest of other people who want to know what the finances were at that time, because Walter Scott, in his journal at that time, talking about 86, he was really skint, and he was a wee bit narc, but he couldn't. He was well given. He had loaned Henry Siddons, Daniel Terry, £500, which in those days would have been quite a lot of money. But then Terry went bankrupt in England, and then Scott himself went bankrupt. The price of the Theatre Royal, of which had to be paid by Mrs. Siddons, was £42,000, but you could put three nothings onto that today if that bit of real estate was done. And lastly, I'm curious, does anybody know what's the history of the demolition of it, and when it then became the new theatre that we have in Edinburgh?
I think the problem was when they built that Regent Bridge that goes up towards Kelton Hill, they had to demolish Shakespeare Square.
Yes, so it couldn't have lasted very long beyond Scott's time.
I'm not sure when that would be.
During the Regency, maybe?
Yeah, I mean
After Scott's
after
death.
Scott's death, I think.
Yes.
But the whole of Shakespeare Square went, which was a shame. I mean, apparently it was a very lively sort of area with a number of well-known taverns and things, convenient for the theatre customers and so on.
What was going on in the Caledonian Theatre? Vatimar was a huge success with the Ventriloquy Act. But when was the Caledonian Theatre built at the top of Leith Walk, and what sort of show was on most of the time?
That had been there for a long time, but of course they didn't have a licence, a patent. So there'd be a lot of plays with lots of songs, equestrian displays where, the whole action is set on horseback. I think they filled the parts of the theatre with water and had water spectacles. They had ventriloquists, they had opera, they had Italian concerts. I mean, they tried to do everything that they could do to get around the fact they hadn't got a licence for sort of straight drama.
One of my favourite novels is Kenilworth, and I would have liked to have seen that adapted for the stage. Is there any novels that you wish could also have been adapted? And if so, would you like them to be represented as it was written or adapted for a modern audience?
Wow. Well, there's lots of Scott operas, of course. I mean, hundreds of them. People have written whole books about it. But I think most of the Scott novels did get the treatment either here or in London. But they didn't seem to make much. They tried with the poems, but interestingly, they didn't seem to be such a success.
Would any, do you think any are suitable for today's audience in an adapted form? And would you choose any one that we could try to revive?
Rob Roy went on and on and on. Right in the 1960s, there was a performance of Rob Roy before the Queen Mother in the 1960s.
Yeah.
That one lasted. I think a present-day audience would find them a bit odd.
I mean, it was a long evening at the theatre in Scott's time. It sort of started early in the evening, and they expected a sort of curtain raiser, a full-length play, a farce afterwards, and people just came and went, you know, but it would last for hours. And they're quite elaborate effects. I mean, most people like Alexander Naismith were doing scenery painting for the theatre. I think the only thing that's left of this is a few designs for the Heart of Midlothian, but I mean, it was quite something.
I've just checked, and the Regent Bridge was built between 1860 and 1819,
Oh,
so that was on Shakespeare. Hence the name, as I said, during the movie.
Well, then it can't have been the bridge, because the theatre was still there after that was opened.
Well, it didn't knock the theatre down, but it did seem the buildings of Shakespeare Square were knocked down.
Yes, they were. Maybe they left the theatre on its own for a bit.
Longer. Yeah, that makes sense.
Could I volunteer, just not so much as a question as a thought, that I do think that it helps us to understand Walter Scott's novels if we realise how enthusiastic he was when it came to going to plays. And I imagine that it's possible that when he was trying to envisage how a scene would be constructed in a novel, he would sometimes see a play and see the possibilities unfold.
I'm sure you're absolutely right. That's spot on. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Waverley, where you get Flora in front of that waterfall and all the rest of it. That's like a piece of stage scenery in the background, and it's that scene where he comments on the likeness between Fergus and Flora being like Mrs. Siddons and her brother. So I think you're absolutely right. They were very close in his mind. It's a shame somehow he never really took off as a playwright, and yet he got all the gifts. Maybe Shakespeare was just too much for them, but they, you know, that generation, they went into blank verse and heroics and things, and Scott had every gift to be a wonderful sort of writer of plays, and he never seemed to let the naturalness that he had in the novels and the poems sort of come into the efforts he made to theatre.
Did he get any financial gain from the dramatisation of his novels?
No.
None at all, other
No.
than they was part a share in the theatre itself.
Well, yes, you've got a share
Yes.
in the theatre, but
Yes.
no.
No,
I mean, anybody could take the novel and hack it about and turn it
they
into a
could,
play.
yes. Are there any other questions for anybody? Or draw to close? Well, just stay there nearby. I've got a few announcements to make, and then we'll draw to a close. The next event at the club will be the 110th annual dinner, held on Thursday the 2nd of May, 6:30 for 7 o'clock, here in the new club, in this room itself, when our president, Sir Maxwell MacLeod, will propose the toast to the memory of Sir Walter Scott, with subsidiary toasts to be proposed by the City of Edinburgh, to the City of Edinburgh by the Lord Provost and the Royal Celtic Society by its chairman, Alan Hay. But I don't know quite why I'm announcing this, because it's sold out, I believe.
There's a waiting list.
Oh, there's a waiting list. I think we could manage 50 in this room. We had it in this room last year and it was a success. To get into we don't want to go into what's called the long room, I think, which people liken it to a greenhouse, a greenhouse, don't they?
Public swimming baths. Yeah.
Or swimming baths. So the next leap up demands over 100 or more to go into the main dining room.
80.
80 is it? Perhaps we'll get there. one day in the future, the way that things are going. But it is successful. Perhaps people realise what good value £50 for an Edinburgh dinner with speakers in a venue like this is, or perhaps it's the charisma of the speakers and the host, who knows. But anyway, we managed to attract enough people and the amount of people we want. After that, there'll be our annual general meeting on Thursday the 16th of May, followed by a talk by Lieutenant Commander Dermot Gunn, OBE, who is with us, look straight in front of me now, on the subject of Sir Walter Scott Impressions of Russia. This in the wake of the recent award to Dermot of the Pushkin Medal in recognition of his services in the advancement of British-Russian cultural understanding. One more thing that Lee has mentioned to me, that he's in a state of readiness to take pictures of people standing right next to the great man. He'll be in situ, able to do that about 5 minutes after we go out and have canapes if people want to come in here. And he'll tell you how you can access the pictures, and all on a gratis basis. My wife and I, Gillian, had a picture of this taken about 2 years, standing up on either side of the great man, and we called it "There are three in this marriage," by the way. So you know, there are opportunities to vary the pattern as well. But Lee will be there. Now, I try and remember all the things in this sequence, and I think I'm just about managing it. This is our token thanks, object of thanks, which is a book of past presidential addresses. It's one of the rare unsigned copies. I'm sure people here will sign it for you if you wish, readily. Thank you very much. It's a small token, yes. And the last thing for me is to call on Professor Ian Campbell to give our vote of thanks.
Jill, that was a wonderful evening. Peter Garside listed some, and there are more than he mentioned, of the editors in this room, people who are working on various bits of Scottish editing. It used to be said that one well-placed bomb could wipe out a lot of people's work. One well-placed bomb in this room, I'm not suggesting it, could wipe out a lot of 19th century Scottish literature, editing, in progress and achieved. But one of the people who has achieved most is Jill. For decades now, we have watched Jill, who edits quietly, often unnoticed, but I can tell you from decades of working with Jill, she delivers on time. And this is a rare academic achievement. It's scrupulous editing of the highest quality. And as you've heard from Peter's introduction, it's been spread over a wide field of Scottish literature. She has been courteous, friendly and generous with helping other editors. And I think you've heard tonight the results. Beautifully put together, beautifully presented, and always backed up with first-class research. These are the qualities we associate with Jill, and tonight we've seen those qualities to their best advantage. So Jill, thank you, and anytime you want to come back and continue this, we'll be glad of it. Thank you.